Hello, my name is Juan Cabrera, and I'm a research assistant professor with UMKC, and I'm a state extension specialist for vegetable production for University of Missouri Extension. Today, I'm going to talk to you about indoor mushroom cultivation, and the reason why I'm talking about this is because I'm also a research faculty that looks into controlled environment agriculture, and indoor mushroom cultivation also is also part of controlled environment agriculture. So let's begin by defining mushrooms. So they belong to the fungi kingdom, and the fungi kingdom is one of the five kingdoms of living organisms. And we use this to classify organisms based on similar tree traits that they have. And there's many fungi. Some of them are beneficial. For example, we have yeasts that we use industrially to produce breads and beers, adult beverages. We also have we also have fungi that we use for food, um, like blue cheese. Actually, that blue color and that characteristic taste of blue cheese comes from a a fungus growing inside the cheese. But we also have undesirable fungi, like mold is one of them. We also have diseases that are fungal related diseases. We also have organisms or fungi that help out in the environment, in the ecosystem. They provide functions such as degrading organic matter and returning that carbon into the soil. And today we're going to talk about fungi that we call mushrooms, which are the ones that we eat. Notice that this talk is not going to be about foraging mushrooms out in the wild. I'm not an expert in that. I cannot identify mushrooms, but I somehow work with mushrooms that we cultivate indoors. And those are known fungus that are not going to be harmful. So if you're interested in mushroom foraging, I'm including some links there so you can have so you can check them out. The Missouri Department of Conservation has guides and activities for mushroom hunting. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in foraging, to contact the Missouri Mycological Society. They have trainings and they have events when they go out in the wild to collect mushrooms and also do those education events. Let's look at the biology of mushrooms. So we have the mature mushrooms, and what we see here is the fruiting body. It's one part of the whole organism. And the mushroom has some gills, some mushrooms, not all of them, but for this specific example, this mushroom has gills, and within those gills, if we had a microscope and we look up close, we'll see these structures that produce spores, which are microscopic structures. So spores, they're similar to seeds in plants. They're the unit that the organism uses to spread and reproduce and grow new organisms. So these are microscopic. The spores are going to land into a substrate that provides the ideal conditions for that spore to germinate into a hyphae. And then when you have multiple hyphae and it starts growing, the hyphae starts to spread. The consortium of hyphae is what we know as mycelium. So if you've seen mold growing in a bread and you see that white fluff thing that's growing on the like cottony thing that's growing on the bread, that's the mycelium, right? And eventually it spreads into the substrate. And if the conditions are right, that microscopic mycelia is going to cover the whole inside of the substrate. Um, and if the conditions are right, it's going to start producing the fruiting body, which will be the one that will generate the spores for the next generation. In the wild, this happens typically with mushrooms growing on tree logs. This will happen in the fall, in the spring, after a rain event. And the reason why I mention this is because when we try to grow them indoors, we're trying to mimic the outside environments. So we want a humid environment but that it is cool, right? For most of the mushrooms that we grow indoors. And notice that what we have here in the picture is a dead tree. These type of mushrooms are not going to go and infect living trees. They are organisms that they decompose organic matter, dying something that's already dead. Um, just another type of example or an illustration here that I can use to illustrate the different components of a mushroom. What we see here is a fruiting body, and then we have the hyphae, which is extensive, and sometimes it's really hard to see. They're kind of like the roots of the system, but they are not plants. Mushrooms are not plants. They behave differently. They produce CO2 and they breathe in oxygen as opposed to plants. So there's different stages of cultivation if you're trying to grow them indoors. First one is selecting a strain that you know that will generate fruiting bodies or mushroom that is desirable for the market that you want to sell. Then you want to select a suitable substrate and prepare that substrate to receive that strain. And that's what we have here in these pictures on the left. Typically, the strains are purified into petri dishes, and you do this under sterile conditions in the laboratory. Then you collect this concentrated, purified strain, and then you inoculate the substrate. Now, the substrate has to be sterilized, right? Because there's other organisms in the substrates that will overtake the mushroom, and you may end up having no mushroom production, or you may end up having other organisms that you do not know if it's going to be harmful for human consumption, right? So you need to sterilize this substrate. After you sterilize the substrate, you inoculate, and inoculate is the process by which we bring the purified culture in contact with this substrate, right? And then depending on your objective, what you're going to be growing, if you're going to be producing spawn or if you're going to be producing the blocks, you need to mix in that spawn. And I'm throwing out terms. I'm going to explain what a spawn means and what a block means later on. Then you need to incubate that. And in this incubation process is when that mycelium that you see here, that hyphae, starts to spread through the substrate and colonize it, right? So that has to happen. So we need to incubate, provide the proper conditions for that mycelia to grow. And then once the mycelia colonizes the substrate, you change the conditions, mimicking the outside world, so that you can initiate the fruiting or the development of these fruiting bodies that you see here. And then once they're fully grown, you can harvest them. The process by which you harvest them is you can grab the mushroom, twist it, and pluck it. You can also use a knife, and after you harvest, you do not wash it. That's one thing they had to take care of. You do not wash it, and you had to refrigerate it between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep them in refrigeration for that. So I mentioned some terms, and there's different sectors in the industry. If you want to control the whole production, you can do vertical integration. You can do all the steps in your operation. But many people or many commercial growers, they are focused on the fruiting stage. So they buy the blocks. That's what you have here in this picture. They buy the blocks and they only care about providing the conditions for that block to generate the fruiting bodies, right? There are some individuals that they focus their whole business enterprise in block production. So they produce the spawn, and then they inoculate the growing media with the spawn, and then they sell the blocks. They incubate the blocks and they sell the blocks so that the next person that buys the blocks, they can just care about fruiting and selling to the final consumer. And there's people producing the spawn. And let me define what spawn is. I think I haven't done that, and I think I promised you that I was going to do that. So a spawn is the source of inoculum. If you think about using the mushroom directly from this media, you're gonna end up using a lot of this media to inoculate. So it is easier for you to use a cheaper media, which is what we call spawn. So you inoculate, let's say, sawdust with this media, you incubate it, and then you're gonna have the mushroom just colonizing that spawn or that sawdust. And it's gonna be something that's cheaper than growing media to use as a substrate, and you can have the mushroom just grow in it, multiply itself, and then you're gonna have more seeds. Let's call it that way. It's kind of like the seeding material that you're gonna use to produce blocks. So spawn is a source of inoculum, right? And it is the media that we use to insert the fungus into the growing substrate that we're gonna use for block production. Now spawns, you can also use the spawn for log production if you're gonna do log production outdoors, but you can also use the spawn to inoculate blocks for indoor production. Growers that are just focused on fruiting and sales, they're going to buy blocks, right? And typically these blocks were already inoculated. They already went through the 8 to, I don't know, 12 weeks. It depends on the species. Some species um, require a lot of time for incubation. For example, oysters, oyster mushrooms are easy. I mean, they're forgiving. If you're a beginning mushroom farmer and you want to start doing this, oyster mushrooms are the ones that are very easy to grow. They typically incubate between 10 to 28 days. If you're gonna do shiitake mushrooms, well, on the other hand, it takes 1.5 to 3 months for that mushroom to incubate. So take in consideration that if you're selling blocks, you have to have several batches at different stages so you can have consistent production. Um, and the growing conditions in the incubation process is different. It's a little bit warmer, 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the incubation process. And I'm gonna have a future slide when you do the last step, which is fruiting and sales, you want colder temperatures, cooler temperatures. So yeah, so these are the different industry sectors. As a grower, you can specialize yourself in spawn production um, or block production, or you can just specialize in growing the final stage of the mushrooms to the end consumer. Now, each of them have different infrastructure requirements, each sector, and each sector requires different set of skills and knowledge, right? So spawn production requires that you have some microbiology knowledge and that you have lab grade or yeah, it's kind of lab grade equipment to ensure that your strain is kept purified and that there's no contamination, right? So people think like, oh, I'm gonna learn how to grow mushrooms. I'm gonna have morels. So there are some organisms that or mushrooms that we still do not know how to grow them or cultivate them indoors or outdoors. And there's active research trying to figure out what do we need to have in place to do this. But sometimes it is just very difficult to mimic the conditions out there. For example, truffles, there has to be a specific symbiosis between the mushroom and the specific tree and microbial community in the soil for them to thrive. That's why they're so hard to grow in cultivation. So we have morels, porcini mushrooms, and chanterelles and truffles. Those are the ones that are we haven't figured out yet how to do it indoors. And these are the common commercial species that you can grow indoors. You have oyster mushrooms, and there's many varieties of oyster mushrooms, many colors, sizes. They're really easy to grow. They're very forgiving. If you're gonna if you're gonna try to grow mushrooms indoors as a beginning farmer, I would recommend that you begin with oyster mushrooms. You have lion's mane, shiitake mushrooms, chestnut mushrooms, trumpet, king mushrooms and maitake mushrooms. Um, some of them, I think all three of these have similar growing conditions, so you can grow them in the same production unit. There's other mushrooms out there, but these are the ones that have shown to be successful in a commercial setting. And this is for fruiting, for growers that are just interested in fruiting and harvest. These are the conditions that we need to keep when growing them indoors. Temperature range between 60 and 65. Now, these are just rule of thumbs. If you're interested in specific mushrooms, please make sure to contact your supplier or the people giving you the spawn and ask them about information about growing the mushrooms because some of them have specific requirements. But as a general rule of thumbs, if you keep the temperature between 60 and 65, you should be good. And notice that one thing that's going to be a challenge, especially for HVAC system, is to keep a relative high relative humidity without having condensation inside the unit, right? So 85 to 95 degrees relative humidity because you do not water the mushrooms. They take the water from the air, right? And then carbon dioxide, they breathe, and if carbon dioxide accumulates too much, you're gonna suffocate the mushrooms and they're gonna die. So you're gonna keep, for some species, they do not tolerate when the CO2 levels go up to 800. Some species can tolerate higher levels of CO2, but as a rule of thumb, just keep it below 800. So that means that you're gonna have to exchange the air, exhaust the air in that unit based on the CO2 level. Now, there are different systems that you can use for fruiting and harvest. Um, I've tried, I've bought the bags, the blocks, the ready to fruit blocks, and that's fun. And that's the first picture that I had in the slide. It's a ready to fruit block that I bought, and I grew a mushroom in my house. I also tried these kits. They sell kits. Now, the first one, you don't do anything. You just cut some, you slice the bag with a clean knife and just wait, and it's gonna fruit. Now, I tried the second kit. They sell kits that comes with the material. It comes with the spawn, and it gives us some proportions. So basically, what you do here is you grab like a high carbon substrate. For example, you can use hay, or like you see here in this box, you can in this picture you can have cardboard, and then you mix it with something that's not as dry. For example, spent coffee grounds. But you had to boil the cardboard and or the hay, boil it for an hour or two, and then drain it, let it cool, and then mix it in with spent coffee grounds. And the reason why I mentioned spent coffee grounds is because when you brew the coffee, you heat it up. It's kind of sterile, right? So the key word here is sterile, keeping that sterility. And then this container, I cleaned it with 70% alcohol. I sprayed it and I cleaned it, and I made sure that my hands were clean too before doing this. And then you mix in the spawn. The spawn comes with these kits with the hay and the coffee grounds. You thoroughly mix it, and then you put that in a container. You seal these containers have some holes. You can drill the holes, but you seal them with paper towels because you still need to have fresh air coming in. And over time, when they use spray them with water. That's pretty much what you need to do. If you're a DIY enthusiast, you can buy these mylar boxes or cages. They come in different sizes. And I've seen many successful commercial growers using these big mylar systems, and they built their own humidifying and temperature control systems. And if you're interested in that, there's some DIY option. There's MyCodo, which is the brains, the software interface that controls the environment with the sensors that you can check out. And there's many projects out there that uses MyCodo to set up mushrooms. And there's one that I like because they it's a step-by-step guide to building your infrastructure for handling the pure cultures in um, sterile conditions, right? That's why I had inoculum to table project, and it gives you the step-by-step guide to build your infrastructure for that, and also how to build the system to incubate and fruit the mushrooms, right? And then it shows you at the end how to harvest it, and it gives you a recipe on how to use the mushrooms. So it's a nice project. I personally, I'm gonna try to follow this step-by-step guide to build my own system from inoculum to production. So keep in touch. Hopefully, I'll make a video later on with that. But they also sell these grow units that they can control the temperature. They're fairly expensive, but you can have these systems also that you can buy. And there are some companies out there that are retrofitting basements, and also they're retrofitting these shipping containers that they have all the stages from inoculum to fruiting in these systems. So if you're more interested about indoor mushroom cultivation, there are some good resources out there. The Cornell Small Farms projects has a lot of information and resources about mushroom production. They also have a list of suppliers for spawn. And if you're interested in outdoor log cultivation, I'm not your guy for that. Please contact Sarah Havens, and here's her contact information.